Kia ora koutou. No mai, haere mai. Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Sunil. I'm one of the team here at Boma. Firstly, I'd just like to thank and acknowledge Ngā Tua Huririri. Apologies for my pronunciation there. Just coming to grips with my new home in Tātai, Christchurch, and just wanted to acknowledge the mana whenua from where I stand here now in Tātai, Christchurch. It's now my incredible honour to welcome Dr. Hana O'Regan to the SPOMA Intro to Equity for Leaders Impact session. Dr. Hana O'Regan is an extraordinary Māori language expert, Chief Executive of Tātai Aotearoa, Core Education, an educator, an activist, a leader, an absolute inspiration. Hana, it's an honour to welcome you here. Thank you for joining us. I'm now turning it over to you.
And kia ora, Sunil, nei rā te mihi atu ki a koe. Me taku hikaka kia tūhono atu ki a koutou katoa I tēnei rā. It's wonderful to be here with everyone today. So thank you for that introduction, Sunil. Like you, I mihi to ngai tū ahuriri, the mana whenua here, but also to all of you from wherever you are joining us from around the country. It's thank you for making the time. And we're going to get into it because we have an hour, and the usual trouble that I have is trying to keep within that hour, and I want to make sure that this session is as interactive and engaging for you as possible. So once again, thank you everyone who has joined. Okay, so let's get into it. To set the scene and to give you some understanding of how I've got to the point of developing this approach to talking about equity is because of a rather long career now. And I think when we start counting in multiple decades of working in the spaces of education and educational equity, but also Māori education and achievement, engagement and attainment, etc. And right from an early stage, I've been exploring the conversations around te tiriti, around, as I've got on the screen here, kaupapa like cultural revitalisation, discussing racism, bilingualism, and I've found if you can imagine if you can reflect back to what the landscape's been in Aotearoa over that time, it's a pretty tricky series of conversations to have. I usually go in, whether it's a lecture, a workshop, or a public speaking event, for many years, I'd prepare myself for what I would imagine would be some of the attacks back against some of these kaupapa. And I found myself getting quite defensive. And I think you can appreciate that we've had this a real reluctance within the country to talk about some of these issues, and they're emotionally charged often when we have the conversations around them. So what I did was I ended up landing on this beautiful word, equity. And I found that the need to be defensive kind of eroded because people had less of a negative response to equity. Almost like we hadn't had the time to prepare the attack on it. We haven't been exposed to any rhetoric that's anti-equity, and you have to agree you can sound like a bit of a crash, or there might be all sorts of other words that might come to the fore. If you say, oh, I don't agree with equity. No, equity is not a good thing. I don't agree with equitable outcomes for learners or for people in employment, etc. And so by using the term equity and talking about many of these same issues, I found it a lot better as a tool to open people's hearts and get us into the conversation. So that's why I've found the beauty of the word equity, but it's also enabled me to go into places and talk about things that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to do. So why focus on mana taurite or equity? Well, the reality is that I come from a perspective that, and I'll own it, I'm talking about biculturalism and te tiriti as well, but with this equity lens. But I've come from a perspective that we haven't done a good job as a country at having the conversation. I believe that we've burdened the kaupapa of biculturalism and te tiriti with generations of negative rhetoric that have kind of cloaked it and meant that it becomes this point of tension within our conversations. But if we start to really unpack equity and acknowledging that we haven't had a lot of discourse on this kaupapa as a country, like I said before, we start to open up doors. The reason why it can be a hard thing and why I think we need to really focus on equity as a kaupapa is because it's acknowledging that for those people who haven't experienced inequity, if it's not part of their day, if it's not part of their every hour and their daily reality, that they might not see what might be inequitable right in front of them. That means that if you haven't experienced it yourself, you can be oblivious to something that might for others be really obvious. For those people who experience inequity, doesn't matter what kind that is, but for people, marginalized communities, those with disability, those that experience prejudice on a regular basis, you don't get the choice of whether or not you want to see it. It's pretty much there in front of you. But for those who don't, you've got to really deliberately pull in an equity lens and make sure you're looking at things in a new way if you want to see what might not otherwise be readily accessible to you. And because we haven't had the conversation very well in the country, it means it's hard. It means it's a challenge for us. It makes us feel uncomfortable often. And that's partly because we haven't told our story well. We haven't had access to our story, which means we don't have a clear view of how the issues that we might be experiencing right now, right in front of us, we haven't got a clear view of how they've come to be, what's caused them. So we get confronted with really hard issues, but we don't necessarily know the journey that it's been on in order to get to that point. We've also got a really strong blame culture. Now, I'm not sure, I know we've got people from a whole range of different industries and businesses and sectors who have joined with us today. It's not actually just in one sector. I talk about education a lot, but it's not just in one sector. It does go across. And I'll give an example. We've got, in this blame culture, we've kind of got this view of, rather than looking at what's in our control, in our sphere of control, of blaming others for the situations we have. And that means that we could say, for instance, in education, as an example, primary school will often blame early childhood for not preparing the kids and getting them to a point where they're ready to start at primary school. So we have to go back and teach them. And then secondary school blame primary school for the same thing. Tertiary blame secondary, industry and businesses blame tertiary, and if all else fails, we blame the whānau. We're blaming someone else all the time. And you can take that kind of blame culture. Well, sometimes we blame Australians or someone else if we haven't got it right. That blame culture starts to come through really strongly as in part of our psyche. And it means that we can justify or abdicate responsibility for inequities to someone else. We put it in somebody else's camp. So we don't necessarily look at what our role in it is. But it also means that we can get really defensive and part of or feel personally attacked because we've got this narrative about ourselves as a country. We can feel really attacked when somebody then challenges or raises awareness about inequity because we think it might be hitting us personally. So that's a real challenge for us. So I think if we think about this and we move to the next slide, just to talk about where this perception has come from, we've got a really dominant narrative. We've got a really dominant narrative where we have a country, we've been raised believing we've got equal opportunity. It's actually a pretty proud thing in our narrative about ourselves, that we are a country of equal opportunity. We've got quite a strong egalitarian narrative. And what that means is that we get drawn into things and discussions around things being fair or not. Now, when you look at the equality versus the equity approach, the equality, this idea of equal, things having to be the same, means that people get really upset if one group gets more boxes or has things that they don't, because it's seen as unfair if we don't get the same input. Even if you didn't need that extra box to be able to achieve what you needed to achieve, it's unfair because someone else has got it. That makes it really hard to have any kind of interventions to support equity, which means equitable access and equitable opportunity for people. So that's a real challenge for us. And I think that's one of the reasons we have such a tension between things like affirmative action policies or initiatives to support one group of a community to have equitable access, because people essentially translate it back to them and they think they're missing out on something and they think it's unfair, even if they didn't need the thing in the first place. So let's unpack why we think the way we do. And it's hard for us to shift the beliefs that we have about a history or the beliefs we have about ourselves and the history that's helped to create it if you haven't had access to that history. And that's been the case in New Zealand. We have to understand that the narrative that we've had or that we've been exposed to intergenerationally, like for a very long time now, that narrative has been intentionally designed to help shape the way we think. And it's also been deliberately designed to support the political, the social, and the economic outcomes that we have today. I know that sounds like a conspiracy theorist point of view, and I want to assure you that that's definitely not the case. But it is, from my perspective, something that sits fundamentally at the foundation of understanding equity, because unless we can understand the intentionality of the inequities that we experience today, it makes it really hard to get to the point where we can really think creatively about what we can do within them or to respond to them. But this is a big statement, and so I am going to back it up. It's not just going to be one of those things that I throw out there, but it's just to try and acknowledge the space that I believe we're in, and the space even now, today, that we're having in the conversations in our communities. So I want to share one of these things, knowing that it's a hard thing to do, and it's come from a historic lack of access to a history and a conversation. I want to share something, a quote from my father. And he said this to me at a time when I was angry at him because he was being too nice and understanding with people who were being blatantly racist and actually quite vile. And it was many years ago now. I had him on the radio, and I wanted him to really tear them apart and tell them the way it is. And in response to my interview questions, he was calm and considered and also really understanding and supportive. And so I was quite angry about this. And he said this to me when we got off air. He said, Hana, you need to understand that you've had access to information that others might not have had. And this was the quote: if you only knew what they only know, you'd probably think the same. At the time, I didn't really appreciate it because I thought he needed to be stronger. But what he did tell me was, if people haven't had access to that history, how do you expect them to think any differently? So that made me go on another journey of ensuring that we bring people into a conversation and make sure that we are sharing the same level of information, and from there we can make more informed decisions, and that will influence the way we think. Okay, so let's unpack our story of ourselves, and I'm hoping you are going to be able to use the chat, because at the moment I'm not sure that I can see other people's comments in the chat. Rosario, I'm just letting you know I can only see the panelists in the host chat, so I'm hoping people are going to be able to answer this. So if somebody wants to chuck something in the chat, please, just with a thumbs up or anything, so I can see that I can view it. Oh, thank you. I can breathe. Much appreciated. Okay, so let's start with this then. I'm going to unpack what we know about ourselves. So I want us to think about being Kiwi. I want us to think about being what we're known for. And think about when people talk about being Kiwis, what do they think and say? What are our characteristics? And please feel free to put these in the chat. Now I can see it. I can follow it as well. So what are we known for when people talk about us? What are our characteristics and our emblems of identity? Okay, so we've got laid back, friendly, All Blacks, haka, chilled, number 8 wire. What does number 8 wire represent, people? But perfect. Easygoing, silver fern. Again, number 8 wire, innovative. I'm not sure if it's innovative or innovative, but we'll go with it. Outdoorsy, hardworking, our environment, perfect, clean, green. Afraid of being a tall poppy, ka pai, not controversial. You can see I'm reading at speed now, farmers, land and water. Again, haka, farming, Pacific, fantastic. Thank you, family punching above our weight. So, you know, we're this little country at the end of the Pacific, but, you know, we take on the world stage. Sports, clean green, hangi, kuru, perfect. I think you've already got, and you've already pretty much covered what we've got about here. So look, you would have got an excellence in our, how good's that? We've even got somebody just put in the bumblebee. I'm not sure if that's the buzzy bee, but there you go, center stage in this thing. So you can see how, and yes, I had sheep and jandals. You can see how accurate we are in terms of what we know people say about us and the narrative we have. Now, believe me, I know it's not something that is necessarily true. I know now, and we've heard about it, that our ability to call ourselves clean and green is up for grabs. You know, I think it's people know that that's a bit of a push, and depending where you are in the country, sheep or red band gumboots or jandals will come up. But pretty much, I can assure you, the reason why this is a pre-prepared screen is because this is the feedback that I've had. One end of the country to the other, we're known for our positions on equity as well. And if I'd given you more time, I'm pretty sure you would have got everything that was on this. But even the number 8 wire, which younger generations don't necessarily always know what it is, but that idea that this is a part of who we are as a people, who we are as a country. And I love that point. Sally, thank you. The slightly rebellious against the big powers. Well, there you go. That's that nuclear free, saying this little dot in the Pacific saying to the superpower, you're not going to bring your nuclear warships through our waters. Thank you very much. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for that. I now want you to do the same exercise, and I want you to do it. I'm just changing one word. I'm changing Kiwi to Māori. So again, this is what people say. I'm not asking you what you're thinking. I'm asking you what are the commonly known characteristics or emblems of Māori identity? And when people think and talk about Māori, what do they think and say? Okay, happy-go-lucky, moana, spiritual, warriors, haka, brown, disadvantage, myths and legends, can play the guitar, community, poor health, crybabies, pāmoko, colonized, kaitiakitanga, I'm reading at speed, kapahaka and waiata, welcoming and friendly, guardians of the land, overrepresented in prisons, dole bludgers, absolutely, gangs, abuse, whānau focused, humble, sense of humor, indigenous, poor outcomes, beautiful, abused and abusive, funny, I don't know, probably referring to my my humor there. Kapahaka, great soldiers connecting to the land. Criminal. Kapai. Thank you. And I realize that, and I should have probably said this at the beginning, some of these might be triggering for people because people will immediately start to have a reaction about what we've said. And thank you, play the guitar, uneducated, tūranga waiwai. So this is the point. If I then put this up, what have we got? We've got good singers. We've got the haka, we've got pāmoko and pounamu, we've got can play the guitar, which was used as well, artists, the humour was there, and then we've got these other things, which are often the negative, the good thing, you know, the domestic violence, the abuse, the gangs, the bad health statistics, and we captured a lot of those in what was said. Often, and I have to say, I appreciate the fact that people have got really good engagement here. Often in a room, if you can imagine me having this conversation in a room, whether it's 50 or 500, Everyone goes to the positives first, and then somebody brave usually goes, and there's those other things that people talk about that are out there as well. And the challenge that I put to people is, so how do you think it feels being Māori in this country when you know this is the view people have of you? How do you think a child feels being Māori when even the good bits, the things that Māori are good at, the guitar, sports, art, singing, rhythm, even those are limited? We don't have the innovation, the punching above the weight. We don't have the number 8 wire mentality. Those things aren't the first things that people come when we think of Māori, that they're a real limited view. How do you think it feels being Māori? Yeah, thanks. Stink, labelled for a few bad thoughts. Defined, stigmatized, ashamed, not positive, stereotype. Yeah, absolutely. And the challenge is we don't talk about this as a country. We've got this idea that everyone has an equal chance, but we don't often consider, actually, do you have an equal chance when you know the teacher is also able to come up with those same stereotypes? And when you have the employer or the person at the dairy or the person at the local pools or the person at the library, when you know that this is a stereotype that people have of you, that so much energy is consumed in having to either prove it wrong or say, actually, you want to see bad, I'll show you bad, but so much energy is consumed with it because you're labeled before you walk out the door. And how old do you think you are when you realize that society has this dominant view? And like I said, some people can say, oh yeah, that's a Christchurch problem, or it's a this problem, or South Auckland, or wherever they choose, but it actually is right around the country. How old are you when you think, yeah, okay, so Sally, thank you, Sally, young, school age, anyone? What are the ideas that you might have in terms of, yeah, really young, from birth? I'd probably say at birth, usually you're not necessarily that you're not aware. There's a point in time, but I would say, like you've said, Gina, it's primary school age. Pretty much, it does depend on whether or not you've experienced the overt inequities and whether you've experienced abuse because of those stereotypes or your family have. So the point of the overt contact or the butting against those inequities will be determining how early, but by school, pretty much you're there. In my case, my children, I think, my son was 3 years old when he was first verbally abused for speaking Māori to me in a supermarket by an elderly person. And so from 3 years old, he knew that was going to be that people had a different reaction to even the language he was speaking to his mother. So thinking about that, think about how these stereotypes influence us. How do they influence, just consider for a moment, what part of that dominant narrative impacts the way that we behave and the practices we have. And importantly, what do we do in our environment to actively start pulling these back and unpacking them? Because often if we know they're out there, the challenge, I think, in New Zealand is we don't often have the conversation enough. We don't call them out. We don't talk about where they've come from. And yet they're there and we know they're there. So the idea is that, well, they would influence things like expectations of success, things like recruitment and promotion. They influence the way we engage in relationships, career conversations, teacher-learner relationships. You see, it doesn't matter how advanced, before you meet somebody and you've got that relationship with them, it doesn't matter how informed and along the equity journey you are. What's going to matter for the person that experiences inequity is not what you think of them, because they don't know you at the moment. It's what they think you think of them. And we have to appreciate what they think you think of them is going to be heavily influenced by this view and their knowledge of how society portrays them, talks about them, And it doesn't matter, again, what kind of inequity you might be experiencing if you're in a marginalized group. But as I say, for Māori, you know it all too well. You know it when you're walking down the street, when you're getting on a bus, when you're engaging with the law, when you're going into a library. You don't have the option of not having that interaction. So it is really important for us to think deliberately about what are our actions, what deliberate things do we do in our own work environments, in our own communities, in our own neighborhoods, to unpack that and challenge it and make sure we're bringing an equity lens into the equation. Okay, so we're going now to look at and use education as a bit of an example, but as I say, it is something which is something that goes across different sectors, to look at addressing bias and stereotyping and to understand where it's come from. So the first question is, well, do we really know about how bias has come to be a part of our education system? And was the intent of equity present when in the policies and the thinking that established our education system? You have to think about what the intentions were that sat behind the system if you want to really start analysing how we've got to the point that we've got to, where our bias is absolutely part of it. And I would suggest that equity was a consideration, but it wasn't the intent. So let's, again, it's a pretty full-on thing to say, so let's take another view in terms of looking at how it's come to be. I want us to think about and get a glimpse of how inequity, the absence of inequity has been designed into our system. So that's the genesis of the thinking, the whakapapa of the whakapapa o te whakaaro. And it's important for us to understand that the relationship between the inequities that were designed in education and those that are currently being experienced now, and how they influence current policies, practices, and thinking. And if we look at it from a systems level to start with, we can use the example of the practice of streaming. It's a hot topic, and it's been a hot topic for the last year or so. And within the political debate, we've had different groups saying we promote streaming, or that we're anti-streaming. But I want us to look at that as an example to show how inequity has come to play within it. And I'll just make the point for those not in education, because I had this conversation with my partner. He was getting a very long explanation of the evils of streaming. And probably about half an hour into it, he says, "Look, darling, I just need to know, can you explain what's really wrong with it? Because I just don't understand. I don't understand what you're talking about." And because he was thinking I was referring to live streaming on the internet, as opposed to the practice of streaming within the education system. So I'm glad he let me go, but I'm also glad that he stopped me so I could clarify what he was talking about. So streaming in this case is about really it's where we take, it's a tool that was used in education, and it was strongly rooted in bias and prejudice, but it's a prejudice about people's abilities or perceptions of their abilities, and they're based on things like race, gender, class, physical ability, etc. And what it does is it channels or sifts people into certain subjects, classes, or even schools, but also into occupations, and it's based on those perceived abilities that they have. It's also influenced by the classification of knowledge against ideas of hierarchy. So we judge somebody at being more intellectual because they might be better in these subjects, but and therefore we put them in higher classes or lower classes. But we've also got a hierarchy around that knowledge system, and that's changed over time. But what we often see is on that hierarchy, Western subjects and those based in a Western knowledge system being the top of the hierarchy, and those that are the vocational or in terms of their form, or things like woodwork and woodwork, cooking, the technology, kaupapa, as well as things like Māori language, home economics in my day. Those things are at the bottom of that hierarchy. And so we have this and so knowledge has this classification of what's not just what's important, but what's academic versus non-academic. And absolutely, Māori was not. Māori, as an example, was the only language in our curriculum up until NCEA that was considered to be a non-academic language. If you did in any other language, you were considered to be in the academic top streams, but Māori was positioned in the New Zealand curriculum next to home economics and woodwork. Okay, so let's have a look at where this thinking has come from and how overt it was, how intentional it was. Don't worry, I'm not doing year by year. I'm not doing week by week. There's going to be big jumps in the timeline because I know we're working to a timeline. So let me start by talking about giving some examples. So in 1862, the school inspector reports to the House of Representatives that, I quote, "A refined education or high mental culture would be inappropriate for Māori because they are better calculated by nature to get their living by manual than by mental labour." So, this is 42 years post Te Tiriti, and it was explicit that it wasn't that the academic pursuits were not considered relevant for Māori because Māori didn't have the high mental culture or the academic fortitude. Therefore, they need to be relegated to manual labour rather than the mental labour. And look, to be honest, in 1862, the views of women's abilities were pretty down there as well. And the same kind of prejudice and views of people with disabilities was prevalent as well. So 1862, right? We'll move on. A few years forward, we start to see this playing out in the way that we set up the schools that would establish for Māori. So we have a Native Schools Act passed. And the Act prefers that English is the only language to be used, and more aligned to this notion of streaming, that schools were to focus more on manual instruction than academic subjects. So the policy was deliberate. It was saying absolutely that the schools are meant to focus on the teaching of vocational subjects rather than academic subjects, but it didn't have a block in there that said they couldn't. It was just what the intention, the policy was that were encouraged. And in that time, when these schools were set up, Māori gifted land and contributed to the building of the schoolhouses, and then the government supported with the paying of the teacher's salary, and so that's how those schools came to be. Okay, so we have an outlier. We have an outlier in one of these schools, which are the Hawke's Bay. I'm not sure if anyone's beaming in at us from the Hawke's Bay, but Te Aotearoa Māori Boarding School, Native College. And Te Aotearoa had a principal. His name was John Thornton, and he was a bit of a pioneer at the time. So what he decided was that he saw an opportunity for Māori that if they had access to the academic subjects, that they might envision a day where they want their own lawyers and their own doctors and their own politicians, etc., and their own teachers. So he simply taught at that school what was required to get matriculation into university, and that was 3 subjects. They weren't on the hierarchy that is now, English, maths, and science. Back then, it was classics, which now often comes as the arts, and has dropped a few rungs on the hierarchy of some of those in power, but it was classics, French, and Latin. And so he taught these Māori boys classics, French, and Latin, and they got UE. And so we didn't have a block preventing them going to university at the time, so they got them to university, and then we ended up having our first Māori doctors, our first Māori lawyers, our first Māori scientists. You can see there, Apirana Ngata, Canterbury University, University of Canterbury down here was the first to graduate with a BA LLB. We had Sir Peter Buck as well as a scientist. We had and he was an incredible, Te Rangihiro is his Māori name, incredible work in anthropology as well. And we had Timi Karo or James Carroll, who was a lawyer, the Maui Pomare, the first doctor. Now, they were of a group, but there was this group that came through. So what happened then is a change. What happened was that wasn't the intention of the education system. And so John Thornton was actually pulled, there was a commission of inquiry established, and he was pretty much put on trial and challenged as to why he was insisting that the academic subjects be taught to the Māori students. And he defended vigorously. But like I said, that wasn't the intent. And so they pretty much got rid of him. They sacked it, and an amendment to the Education Act was passed, which forbid the teaching of academic subjects in the Māori schools. And they got a new principal, and it changed. So we started to see, we had this wave of Māori coming through academia, getting into the professions, and then it starts tailoring off, and it becomes much more the exception than it is the norm from that point forward. Not because Māori chose vocational pathways, not because they were more naturally kinesthetic or more naturally aligned to vocational pathways, but because they weren't given the opportunity to succeed in academic pursuits. So it was deliberate, and I think that's what I'm sharing with you. It didn't happen. It didn't just happen. It was absolutely deliberate. And it had a catastrophic impact in terms of then relegating Māori to those low-skill jobs. When you aren't able to get the qualifications that give you that scope of choice, then you get relegated to the lower-skill jobs, which of course are also lower income. So you then start to inhabit more and more that lower socioeconomic position in society, and poverty and the things that come from that. So if anyone tells you one law for all, this is just a few examples of why that's never really been the case within Aotearoa, and is one of our strongly supported myths, but it is still a myth. Okay, so in 1903, it carries on. We start to see the increase attack on Māori language, which wasn't encouraged before, but now we have policies that are around corporal punishment, and ramping up, where children are, the legalised abuse of children in school. You had corporal punishment across the board, but for speaking te reo, if they got caught speaking te reo, that was it was supported to be using the approach that happened with my Irish ancestors, my Welsh ancestors, Scottish ancestors as well, the physical beating of children caught speaking their native language as a way of stopping intergenerational transmission and language communication. And so this started ramping up in the early 1900s, but it carries on in terms of the thinking that's behind, carry on thinking that's behind, sorry, the thinking that is influencing the political decision. So an example, 1915, the inspector of the native school says, so far as the department is concerned, there is no encouragement given to Māori boys who wish to enter the learned professions. The aim is to turn, if possible, their attention to the branches of industry for which Māori seems best suited. So it's pretty explicit, right? Therefore, which Māori seems best suited. And then the point that's just been made, I'm sorry, and I'm trying to read as much as I can from the chat as we go through, but Raphael has just mentioned there that it's important to praise those who fought the status quo, and absolutely. So it's not just John Thornton and the likes of John Thornton, but there's also, and I've only just recently watched the film of No Māoris Allowed, fantastic, absolutely, to bring light on what these deliberate policies were. But here's another one. Another one was actually teachers in 1930 and 1931 actually fought against this. They had a petition which was hugely supported within the New Zealand Federation of Teachers to introduce te reo Māori and culture into the curriculum, but it was blocked. So here we have people standing up and trying to fight, and imagine where we'd be now, even talking about how we get all hyped on things like bilingual signage, if we'd just been able to have access and we didn't have the fear factor that comes from including diversity and including our Indigenous language in our vernacular. So here we have that they got blocked. We have teachers standing up around the country, and it was blocked by the Director of Education, who said, in his view, the natural abandonment of the native tongue involves no loss to the Māori, And the next bit that said that the aim of education, education should lead the Māori lad to be a good farmer and the Māori girl to be a good farmer's wife. So you can see the challenges that have been part of the journey and the story when you consider the thinking, the mindset that was influencing and being able to make decisions around the education system in our country. And I have said, and it makes me kind of giggle on the inside, that I would have been a really crap farmer's wife. And it doesn't matter if it's my Irish ancestry or my Māori ancestry, I'm still pretty sure that I would have been a pretty bad farmer's wife and would have felt completely sorry for the poor animals as well as the farmer. Anyway, moving on. So what happens, it's a big jump from the 1930s to the 1980s, but pretty much those policies did what they had tried to do. They achieved the goal. And so what we find is that Māori were, by the 1980s and 90s, predominantly in that lower socioeconomic position. Our education system had relegated them into the lower skilled jobs, and with only a few exceptions that were able to break through that. The stereotypes about Māori's abilities were definitely ingrained within our system and within the educators, because this is what they've been told and raised on this narrative. And now what we start to see, and it really is only in the 80s and 90s we see the shift, we stop seeing the deliberate belittling of Māori in the policy, the deliberate marginalisation of Māori, and we take Māori out and we talk about socioeconomic factors. And so now what we turn around and we say, the real problem is that Māori don't value education. And if only families were valued education, or they had books in their homes, or they did, these things, then it's their own fault, because they're doing it to themselves because they don't care enough about it and they've got an equal chance. So the narrative changes very dominantly to blaming the community that has been put into a position because of that policy, that deliberate policy of the state. Which is why, when it comes to something like ending streaming, it's something I'm so passionate about, because when we think about the effects of that streaming, it's what we call occupational segregation. The preventing Māori getting into university and pursuing academic pathways means that they're relegated to certain pathways. And that then means that those are the jobs that they get in, that they have access to. And the challenges, it means that we also see within the classes this stereotyping coming into play, where it just perpetuates intergenerational negative expectations of ability. And we see Māori and Pacific being largely placed into the foundation classes, and as opposed to others. And that, like I say, that perpetuates, as Leanne said, the trade training in the 60s, 70s and 80s were one of the ways that was, Māori were absolutely channeled and taken from one end of the country and put into those, which are great pathways. I'm an advocate for the vocational education system, don't get me wrong, but the challenges for us to think about is when that is restricted, when you don't have the options of the others. So I'm a promoter of vocational education, and I've worked in both, but when you don't get the choice is where things start to, where issues of equity come into play. So that's why, we've had not just the iwi around the country, but also in most of our educational organisations at the policy level, and our educational agencies have been working collectively to look at how we can remove streaming from our education system. And it's with the goal of having that done by 2030, knowing that it creates harm, knowing that it's created bias, and actually knowing that it's not the reality of our world is that we have multiple skills and multiple abilities that are required for our communities to work, and that we need to unpack where the judgment and that hierarchy of judgment of knowledge has come from, and address bias at its root. Okay, so another example of this is in terms of, as I said, occupational segregation. And it's talking about the fact that the reality is we see this playing out within the public service, within Pacific people, where they're less likely to be encouraged to pursue different positions or encouraged to pursue different jobs. And we start to see certain groups dominating certain professions and at different levels as well. So this is also part of the outcome of streaming. So why did it, if we think about why did it occur? Well, it's coming back to what I said at the beginning. We have to understand that bias and discrimination are part of these deeply held social beliefs about people's abilities based on gender, ability, physical ability, ethnicity, work and family, and that then plays out in how we employ and the conversations we have about opportunities. And we have examples like, and we have the petition, we have the work against the inequities that were in the realm of pay in terms of pay equity, and we have the Equal Pay Act of 1972. We've done a lot since then, but the reality is we're doing better, but we're still not there. So we've still got a system that actually that continues to be inequitable in the way we treat females and the way we treat others within our society. So it's better, but that doesn't mean it's good enough. And I think we need to keep, when we're thinking about equity and equity in leadership, we need to really go through that process of exploring that and making sure that 50 plus years later, that we are really challenging ourselves. Not many people in New Zealand know that, that even after this point, that we had policies within government departments where you had a different rate for a Pākehā male, a Pākehā female, a Māori male, a Māori female, and then, that was legal. That was the legal approach to remuneration within the public service, or the fact up until 1952, you Indian and those of Indian and Chinese descent were not able to vote and didn't have provisions within our public service for employment. We wonder why people are in, certain parts of our ethnic communities might be have different positions or dominance within retail, etc. We don't even know our own history as to why people, had to find other alternatives because we didn't have that diversity approach within our public service. So we're doing, as I've said here, we're at the best we've ever been in terms of our public our gender pay gap at the moment, but it's still not good enough because there's still a lot of that disparity. So in terms of, and I need to make sure we're leaving some time for questions. You might see me going like that and looking at my watch. I just want us to, and this is an introduction. I know that I'm zooming through at my ADHD speed, and there hasn't been a lot of time to then have that interaction, sorry. But, if we were wanting to then come back to what it takes to be leading in this space and what we need to change, well, the first thing is we need to think about the approach, because the approach that we've taken, first of all, by not even being aware or by closing down conversations or being defensive about conversations, means that even the positive things are happening at an incremental level. And so when you're thinking about transformational change, there are different ways that you can do it. And if you're only tinkering around the edges, well, then we're going to be informing and raising awareness, but we might not see the shift. To be able to move to the next step where you're reforming, that's when you really start getting into those conversations around what are the things that have been designed to create the inequities in the first place, and what might we be able to do to change some of those things, to reform the way that we reform our approach, but also to really change fundamentally what we might be doing. And the next step is transformation. That's when we use, from a basis of awareness and a basis of understanding, we use that to really deliberately unpack those the barriers towards equity, but then we design for equitable outcomes, and then we hold ourselves to account and we implement them in a way which is transformative. And I think we need to understand where we are in our different sectors and our organisations on that journey, on that equity journey. And it's not saying that one is wrong and don't do it, that if you're only at the awareness and the informed stage, that you should push it to the side. Absolutely not. But it is thinking about really placing ourselves on that journey intentionally and being really honest about where it is that we want to go. And so to ask the question, do you know where you own companies or company or organisations? Do you know where you are at in terms of the equity journey? Your story of equity, and have you asked? And think about it at a personal level, what it means for you, whether it's, have you considered these questions of equity in your own business, in your staff room, when you're looking in your local library or the local pools, etc. So finally, and I'm coming down right to the end, so hopefully, Sunil, we'll have some time for some questions. I want us to really think about how we open our eyes to know why the perceptions exist and acknowledge the purpose behind them, the intent behind them, of those inequities, to understand then, once we've got that, we've opened our eyes and we're more aware, that we're in a space where we can bring our hearts into the place and understand the impact of those narratives on those who suffer those inequities, but also open our hearts and really understand the need for change and doing something different. And once we're aware, once our hearts are in that space, then we can bring that creative genius that we have collectively, and we can open our minds to create a new narrative and be brave enough to challenge status quo and current practice. So how do we lead for equity? We need to name it, we need to own it, and we need to act on it. So in conclusion, as I keep on putting another side, saying that I'm at the end, kai a koe te tikaka in my dialect simply means, no pressure, people. Sorry, it doesn't mean that. It means it's up to you. The power's in your hands. But that's why I say no pressure. If there are 3 keywords I would like you to take away, it is the importance of being aware and being brave and being deliberate. And these inequities didn't happen by chance. So we need to actively, deliberately, intentionally strategize about how we're going to change the show, and just really happy to be a part of that journey, if that is appropriate to be so. And with that, Sunil, I'm going to hand it back to you, Ewa.
Brilliant.
Kia ora.
Kia ora, Hana. Thank you for that insightful, confronting, but also inspiring kōrero. Really appreciate it. It's we're going to get some questions soon, so if anyone wants to submit the questions, there's still an opportunity to do that in the Q&A. But the first thing I wanted to say was that we do have a full one-day session coming up with Hana in Aotearoa, Christchurch, on equity for leaders. And that is on Tuesday, the 16th of April. It's an extraordinary opportunity to really dig into this mahi. So if you do have a chance to participate, and if this is a topic that is really important to you, I'd really highly recommend coming along. I'm going to pop a link in the chat to anyone who is interested. And you can reach out to us at Boma via that link as well, and we're happy to answer any questions or provide any more information that anyone needs about that wonderful full-day workshop. Okay, now we've got some questions coming in, but I've actually got a question as well first, Hana, based on there's a bit of a political climate at the moment, a bit of kōrero around that, and so in our current context, what can we do, with some guidance from you on what we can do to kind of practically support this kaupapa in the environments that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, look, thank you, Sunil, and I've seen a couple of the other questions come up on the chat as well. So, but look, I think it's a really good thing that you've raised. I mentioned right at the beginning that we don't have enough of the conversation. So I think being brave enough to first of all start to really unpack what is the information we need to have at hand so that we can have a different conversation. And then start really, you don't have to have all the answers. You don't think that you have to know all the history if you haven't had access to it. But to know that you might not know all that history and say, look, I might even be just challenging it and calling it out, which might be around, to get it started, to say, you know what, I think, you know, that view that you've just shared, or this view that I might have, is only been informed with one set of information. And I think I need to do a bit more research and find out if there's another way of thinking, because I might be applying my own bias. I might not have the right lens when I'm looking at that. So to even ask yourself the question and ask your friends and colleagues the questions means that you're calling out the fact that you might not have all the information required at your disposal. And that's a really good start. I often say, if you're really informed and you want to go hard and lay out the kōrero at a table or something, make sure you got a ride home, strategize when you do it, right time, right place. But we need more people being brave enough to actually challenge it. And you know, we don't do it often enough, I think, with racism and prejudice around that. I think where we see people being with disability being absolutely prejudiced and discriminatory, people feel more compelled to call it out. And I think that's right. We should do that too. I'm not saying stop that, but I'm saying we need to think the same about if we see the harm that's done and that has been caused and continue to be caused within our communities, we need to do the same across the board. So take the first step and then get the support to help you get there. It's one of the things our company does. We're passionate, been doing it for a long time now. So there are people that can help you be on that journey.
Wonderful. That's a wonderful call to courage. Thank you, Hana. Just looking at some of the questions that are coming into the chat here now. I'll just quickly try to read as much as I can here, as quick as I can. So there's a question here from Bex. How do we sell the concept of equitable change, particularly systemic change, in a public service that is currently allergic to transformational change, particularly when there are no dollars, resources, and limited individual transformation SKE in the public services?
Yeah. Okay. So I love that term, allergic to change. What a beautiful term, right? You can almost see the EpiPen coming out in response. Look, I think the first thing is that, again, you need to know it's a hard job. A systemic change requires a lot of planning, it requires engagement, and it's really hard to push against the current if you're one of those voices. So what I would say is think strategically, but the first thing is still to make the awareness. And sometimes you need to be able to really clearly articulate what the benefit is to that organization. It might even be money. That might not be your driver, but you might be able to say, actually, your productivity will increase if you know, so start to think strategically around the language and the way you sell the outcomes, because at the end of the day, in more equitable Aotearoa is going to benefit everybody, and it will benefit every part of our society. So I think being really clear around who you need as allies to help you, but also the way that you convey the message and the benefit back to the people that are making the decisions. I've got one, if you don't mind, if I jump in and answer one of the questions, Sunil. I know we're running out of time.
You go.
So one question was, are we now pushing our rangatahi into Māori trades again? So we've got that whole focus on the vocations. And I say it is an avenue, and it is absolutely something that's been pushed. I would say that's okay too, and if it's not limited to that. I think the problem is if Māori are boxed and certain groups in our society are boxed into that's the only option for you, then that's wrong. But we do need to create more opportunities and avenues into the whole array of educational pathways from vocation to academic and beyond. So I would say just be mindful that it's not being relegated to only those options would be my kōrero. And finally, I think I can see a question saying, it says, what do you believe the best approach for working with leadership teams who continue to marginalise and whakaiti kaupapa Māori and te tiriti o Waitangi? I think, you know, again, this is a hard one, Kathy, and I think if you're a single voice that's standing up to that, it's really hard. So again, I'd find your allies, but the best tool, I would think, is data, and to be able to evidence how explicit those behaviours are, to capture that and to be able to portray it back, and then to get some supports around you to be able to. And I love the mahi that you do, Kathy, and I'm more than happy to be one of those allies that can come in and support as well. With that tool of information, I wasn't very careful not to use other words that might put me in the more activist camp. although I'm okay with that too.
Beautiful. Thank you, Hana. There's some really good reminders there that, it takes a collective effort and also to be really mindful that choices are made available, and that's what equity is all about, is the ability for everyone to have access to things and the choice to decide their own path. Okay,
Absolutely.
a huge mihi to you, Hana, for sharing this kōrero with us. For additional work that Hana does, please look up Tātai Aotearoa. Huge mihi and thank you to everyone who has tuned into this today. Thanks for spending your precious non-renewable time with us. We take this as a gift. It is an honor and we take it seriously. We trust that you got massive value out of today's session. We look forward to seeing you at a future impact session that we hold here at Boma or at Hana's Equity for Leaders full-day workshop. Our time is up. Thank you very much. Ka kite anō.
Ka kite, and thank you everybody for your time as well. It's been wonderful spending this time with you. Hei kona rā, nā hōra mai koutou.